The morning Douglas Fairwell drove out to the Callaway farm. The Oklahoma sky was the color of a bruise, purple-gray at the edges, pressing down low over the flat plains like it had something to say and wasn't sure how to say it. It was early April, but the cold hadn't left. It clung to the red dirt roads, to the fence posts leaning at tired angles, to the bare pecan trees lining the county road like old men waiting for a bus that wasn't coming. Douglas drove a charcoal gray Audi A6, freshly washed, out of place on the rutted dirt road that led off Highway 270 toward the property. He had the heat on low, his suit jacket pressed, a leather portfolio on the passenger seat beside a stainless steel travel mug of black coffee. He was 44 years old, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and had curdled slightly into something harder, jaw too tight, eyes too calculating, the look of a man who had learned early that sentiment was a liability. He checked the GPS one more time, though he had driven this route twice before, once 6 months ago, during the initial assessment, and once 3 weeks ago when he'd filed the preliminary foreclosure documentation with Meridian Capital's legal team in Tulsa. Both times he had not gotten out of the car. He had simply sat on the road, looked at the property through the windshield, and done math in his head. The math always came out the same way. 640 acres of red clay Oklahoma farmland, including a natural water access point from Beaver Creek along the eastern boundary, a serviceable county road frontage of nearly half a mile, and, most importantly, a location less than 4 miles from the newly approved route of the Cherokee Commerce Corridor, a private logistics highway that a consortium of distribution companies was building through central Oklahoma. The corridor's construction was not yet public knowledge. Douglas had learned about it 8 months ago through a contact at the state commerce office. A quiet conversation over bourbon at a fundraiser in Oklahoma City. That conversation had changed his thinking entirely. The Callaway land, assessed by the county at $1.2 million, was worth, once the corridor opened, somewhere between $4 and $6 million to the right commercial buyer. Douglas had already spoken, carefully and indirectly, with 2 such buyers. He turned off the county road onto the long gravel drive. On either side, the winter wheat fields were brown and thin, the stalks barely reaching knee-height where they should have been mid-thigh by now. The drought had been brutal, 3 years of below-average rainfall, 1 year of near-catastrophic heat in August that had baked the topsoil into something resembling ceramic tile. The Callaway operation, which had run profitably for decades growing winter wheat and raising stock or cattle, had taken losses 3 years running. The loan, originally $480,000, refinanced twice, now sat at $612,000 with arrears. Robert Callaway had missed 4 consecutive monthly payments, under the terms of the most recent modification agreement. 3 consecutive missed payments triggered default provisions that gave Meridian Capital the right to accelerate the loan and initiate foreclosure proceedings. Douglas had read the file so many times he could recite it. He parked in front of the farmhouse, a 2-story white clapboard structure with a wide front porch, green shutters, a rusted wind vane on the roof shaped like a rooster. The porch sagged slightly on the left side. A wooden rocking chair sat near the front door. A pair of muddy boots stood beside it, the kind of boots that had seen 10,000 mornings. Douglas straightened his tie, picked up the portfolio, and got out of the car. The air smelled like cold earth and hay, and something faintly chemical, fertilizer maybe, or diesel from farm equipment. A dog barked somewhere behind the house, twice, then went quiet. A windmill near the barn turned slowly in the pale morning air. He was halfway up the porch steps when the front door opened. Robert Callaway was not what Douglas had expected, or rather, he was exactly what Douglas had expected, but the reality of him landed differently than the file photograph had suggested. The man in the county tax records was listed as 68 years old, and he looked it. White hair, thick and uncombed, face deeply lined. Hands visible around the doorframe that were enormous and weathered, the hands of a man who had spent half a century pulling things out of the ground. He wore canvas work pants, a flannel shirt the color of old mustard, and suspenders. His eyes were pale blue and sharp in a way that contradicted the rest of him. He looked at Douglas the way a man looks at weather. Not afraid, not angry, just assessing. "Mr. Calloway," Douglas said, keeping his voice professional, pleasant. "Douglas Fairwell, Meridian Capital. We spoke by phone." "I know who you are," Robert said. His voice was low and unhurried, the Oklahoma drawl thick as molasses poured in January. "Come in if you want coffee. I'm not standing in the cold to have this conversation." It was not an invitation so much as a statement of terms. Douglas accepted it. The inside of the farmhouse was clean but worn. The living room had a braided rug, a wood stove with a low fire, shelves lined with books and framed photographs, a couch with an old quilt folded over the back. The photographs showed generations, black and white images of men in overalls standing in fields, color photos from the 70s and 80s, a wedding picture, children at various ages. On the mantel above the wood stove, a framed needlepoint read, "This land is not ours, we are its." Douglas noticed it and said nothing. In the kitchen, Robert poured 2 mugs of coffee without asking how Douglas took it. He set them on the table, a heavy oak table with 6 chairs, the kind of table that had seen family dinners and homework and arguments and reconciliations. Douglas sat down across from Robert and opened his portfolio. "I'll be direct with you," Douglas said. "I'd appreciate that," Robert said, wrapping both hands around his mug. "You're in default. 4 missed payments, total arrears of $24,800, and under the terms of your loan modification agreement, we have the right to accelerate the full balance and initiate foreclosure proceedings." He set a document on the table, clean, printed, the Meridian Capital letterhead in dark blue at the top. "This is the formal notice. It was also sent certified mail last week." Robert looked at the document without touching it. He sipped his coffee. "I know what it is," he said. "The bank isn't looking to be unreasonable," Douglas continued, which was the line he always used at this point in these conversations, the line that was technically true in the narrowest possible sense. "We have a process. You have 30 days to cure the arrears or to bring a proposal to the bank's loan committee. After 30 days, we proceed, and if I can't cure the arrears, then the bank proceeds to foreclosure." Robert nodded slowly. He set his mug down and looked at the document for a long moment. Then he looked up at Douglas with those pale blue eyes. "Your daddy ever work land?" Robert asked. Douglas blinked. "I'm sorry, your father. Did he ever farm, work land?" "No," Douglas said. "He was in finance." Robert nodded as if this explained something. "Mine did," he said. "And his father before him. And his before that." "You know what that means? 3 generations on the same ground?" Douglas kept his expression neutral. "Mr. Calloway, it means the dirt knows you," Robert said quietly. Not melodramatic, not pleading, just factual. The way he might have said the creek runs east or wheat needs 16 inches of rain. It means there are fence posts your great-grandfather set that are still in the ground. It means every bad year, every drought, every grasshopper plague, an ice storm, and low commodity price, you weathered it because you weren't working a job. You were working something that was yours in a way that goes past paper. There was a silence. "I understand this is difficult," Douglas said. Robert looked at him for a moment, and something in the pale blue eyes said that he understood Douglas did not understand at all, and that this was not a criticism, simply an observation about the limits of a particular kind of experience. 30 days, Robert said. 30 days, Douglas confirmed. Robert stood, which signaled the meeting was over. Douglas capped his pen, closed the portfolio, and stood as well. He left the formal notice on the table. They walked back through the living room. Robert opened the front door. Outside, the sky had lightened slightly, the purple gray giving way to a flat, featureless white. "One thing," Robert said as Douglas stepped onto the porch. Douglas turned. Before this is done, Robert said, I'd like you to see the property, all of it, not just the house. He looked out toward the barn, the fields, the tree line along the eastern edge where Beaver Creek ran. I think a man ought to see what he's taking before he takes it. Douglas hesitated. He had no legal or professional obligation to do this. But something in the old man's tone, not threatening, not pleading, just steady, made him pause. All right, Douglas said. I can do that. Not today, Robert said. Come back in 2 weeks. Give me time to get things in order. Douglas studied him. 2 weeks. 2 weeks, Robert repeated. I'll show you everything. Douglas walked back to his Audi, got in, and sat for a moment before starting the engine. He looked at the farmhouse in his rearview mirror. Robert Calloway was still standing on the porch, watching him leave, arms at his sides, as still and rooted as one of those old fence posts he'd mentioned. Douglas pulled down the long gravel drive. He told himself it didn't matter. The math was the math. 30 days and the farm was meridians. Still, something about the old man's expression stayed with him on the drive back to Tulsa. I'll show you everything. Douglas turned onto Highway 270 and pressed the accelerator. 3 days later, Claire Calloway Reed got the phone call. She was in her car, in the parking garage of the Comerica Bank Tower in downtown Dallas. Still in her work clothes, charcoal blazer, white blouse, her dark hair pulled back, finishing a call with a client when her cell phone buzzed with her father's name. She let it go to voicemail. Her father almost never called during business hours. He knew she was busy. He respected it in the careful, nonverbal way of men from his generation who expressed love through not being a burden. When she listened to the voicemail 40 minutes later, sitting at her desk with the door closed, her stomach dropped. Claire, it's your dad. Nothing to panic about. I wanted you to hear it from me. Got the foreclosure notice from the bank. It's official now. I've got 30 days. I'm all right. Don't come up here yet. I've got things I need to sort through. I'll call you end of the week. Love you, kiddo. His voice was calm. That was what scared her. Her father was the kind of man who went quiet when things were serious. He didn't yell, didn't panic, didn't reach out for reassurance. He went quiet and still and calm, and that was when you knew the water was deep. Claire was 38 years old, a commercial real estate attorney with 11 years of experience, a mortgage of her own, a husband named Brian who traveled for work, and a 7-year-old daughter named Sophie who had recently become obsessed with horses, a fact that, sitting in her office listening to her father's voicemail for the second time, struck Claire as painfully ironic. She called her father back immediately. He picked up on the third ring. I told you not to worry, he said. Dad, you're being foreclosed on. I am a real estate attorney. Worrying is literally my job. A pause. She could picture him at the kitchen table, mug of coffee going cold in front of him. I've got a meeting with the bank man in 2 weeks, Robert said. He's coming to see the property. What do you mean, see the property? The bank doesn't need to tour the farm to foreclose on it, Dad. That's not how this works. I asked him to come. You asked him to. Why? Another pause. Longer this time. There's something I need to show him, Robert said. Something I should have dealt with a long time ago. Dad, Claire's voice dropped. What does that mean? What's in the farm? Come up the same weekend, Robert said. I want you here when I show him. Show him what, Claire? His voice was gentle, but final. Come up the weekend of the 14th. I'll explain everything then. She tried 3 more times to get an answer. He deflected each time, not evasively, but with the quiet, unmovable patience of a man who had decided when the time for a conversation would be, and was not going to be moved off that position by anyone, including his daughter. After she hung up, Claire sat in her office for a long time. She looked at the city through the window, downtown Dallas, glass and steel, and the endless noise of commerce. She thought about the farmhouse, the wooden rocking chair on the porch, the braided rug, the needlepoint above the wood stove that she'd read 1,000 times growing up. This land is not ours. We are its. She thought about her father's voice on the phone. Calm, still, deep water. She booked a flight to Oklahoma City for the morning of the 14th. Claire landed at Will Rogers World Airport just after 9 on a Saturday morning, rented a Ford Explorer at the Hertz counter, and drove southeast on I-40, then down through the smaller roads that cut through Canadian and Hughes counties toward the farm. She had driven this route hundreds of times in her life, as a child in the back seat, as a teenager doing the driving herself, as an adult coming home for Thanksgiving and Christmas, and eventually for her mother's funeral 6 years ago. The landscape never changed. Red clay fields, dormant in early spring, stands of post oak and blackjack, water towers, grain elevators, small towns with a gas station, a dollar store, and a Baptist church. The elementary school and the Baptist church, always the two most solid-looking buildings on the main street. She passed through Holdenville and McAllister, and then turned west again, and the roads narrowed and the trees thickened along the creek bottoms. And eventually the red dirt county road appeared, and the gravel drive, and the white clapboard house with the green shutters and the rooster wind vane. Her father was on the porch when she pulled up. He had coffee waiting. They hugged on the front steps. She had to tilt her head up to look at him, and had always had to do that even when she was grown, and she noticed that he felt thinner. Not dramatically, not alarmingly, just thinner. The way winter trees were thinner than summer trees. "You look tired, Dad. You look like your mother," he said, which was his version of the same thing. Inside, over coffee and eggs, he had made eggs, scrambled with cheddar and green onion, the way he'd always made them on Saturday mornings when she was a kid. He laid out the situation with the methodical clarity of a man who had spent his life assessing problems practically. The loan numbers, the arrears, the 30-day window. "Can we cure the arrears?" Claire asked. She had her notepad out. She was in attorney mode, which was her armor. "Not without selling something," Robert said. "And anything I could sell quickly isn't worth enough." "What about the equipment?" "Old enough it wouldn't bring 20,000 at auction. The truck, maybe 8. Cattle market's been soft." He shook his head. "I've run the numbers every way they'll run, Claire. I can't get to $24,800 in 30 days without selling land, and I can't sell land fast enough with the title situation." Claire looked up from her notepad. "What title situation?" Robert set his mug down. "There's a section I need to show you," he said, "before Farewell gets here this afternoon." The morning shifted. Something in his voice, not the deep water calm this time, but something adjacent to it, something older. "Dad, come on." He pushed back from the table. "I'll show you." They put on coats. The April morning was still cold, the sky the same flat white it had been all week, and walked out across the yard toward the large equipment barn. It stood about 200 yards from the house, at the edge of where the main yard gave way to the working portion of the property. It was a long, low metal building, green painted, maybe 80 feet long, with large sliding doors on the near end, and a row of high windows along the south-facing wall. Behind it, the land opened up into the back fields, and then, along the far eastern edge, the tree line where Beaver Creek ran. Claire had been in this barn hundreds of times as a child. It always smelled like diesel and grease and old hay. It had always contained the machinery of the farm, tractors, implements. The old combine her grandfather had bought in 1974 that her father had maintained with religious devotion. Robert pulled back the large sliding door. The barn looked the same as she remembered. The old John Deere tractor, green and yellow, parked near the front. Shelves of parts and oil cans and tools along the right wall. The combine at the back, enormous and dusty, its header lowered like a resting animal. But Robert walked past all of it, to the back left corner of the barn, where a wooden partition wall divided off a smaller space, maybe 20 feet by 20 feet, that had always been used for storage. Feed sacks, fence posts, miscellaneous equipment. He unlocked a padlock on the partition door. The padlock was new, heavy, commercial grade, the kind you saw on storage units in the city. Claire noticed the padlock. "When did you put that on?" "About a year ago," Robert said. "When I started thinking about what to do." He opened the door. Inside the partitioned space, the feed sacks and fence posts were gone. In their place, stacked carefully along the walls, covered with canvas tarps, were crates. Wooden and metal crates, some of them old, some of them looking relatively newer. In the center of the space, a heavy work table held what appeared to be documentation folders, binders, several rolled tubes that might contain maps or blueprints. Robert walked to the work table and switched on a work light. The space filled with yellow light. Claire stepped inside and stopped. Mounted on the left wall, uncovered, were 3 paintings. They were oils, large format, in heavy frames that looked old. The canvases were darkened at the edges, the varnish cracked with age. Even to Claire's non-expert eye, there was something about them, the weight of them, the quality of the brushwork, that was different from any art she'd ever seen in person. One was a landscape, red and gold, with a quality of light that seemed almost to come from inside the canvas. The second was a figure study, a woman by a window. The third was smaller, darker, a scene Claire couldn't immediately identify. "Dad," she said slowly, "what is this?" Robert sat down on a stool near the work table. He looked at the paintings with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Something between pride and grief, and something else she didn't have a word for. "Your grandfather's," he said. "And before that, your great-grandfather's. Those are paintings." "Yes, they are. Those look like old paintings, valuable paintings." "Yes, they do." Claire turned to look at him fully. "Dad, are you telling me there are potentially valuable paintings in this barn?" "I'm telling you there are definitely valuable paintings in this barn," Robert said carefully. "Whether they're as valuable as I think they are, that's what I've been trying to figure out." He reached across the work table and picked up one of the binders. He handed it to Claire. She opened it. Inside were photocopies of documents, handwritten letters, some in English, some in a language that looked like German. Photographs, inventory lists, what appeared to be auction catalog pages, a letter on the stationery of a museum in Chicago. "Your great-grandfather, Harold Calloway, came out to Oklahoma in 1921, Robert said. "You know that part. Homestead Act land, broke the ground himself." "I know," Claire said. She was reading the documents. "What I never told you, what my own father only told me toward the end of his life, was that Harold Calloway, before he came to Oklahoma, had spent 12 years in Chicago, working in the art trade. Not as a dealer, exactly, more as what they'd call an agent today, a middleman. He moved between collectors, handled private sales, documented provenance." Claire looked up. "He worked in art. He did. And when he left Chicago and came to Oklahoma, and nobody in the family was ever entirely clear on why he left as suddenly as he did, he brought things with him." "These things," Robert confirmed. "And others." He nodded toward the tarped crates. "I've been through most of them over the past year. There are 6 more paintings under those tarps, 2 bronzes, a collection of drawings, at least 40 individual pieces, and documentation, a great deal of documentation that Harold kept, apparently very carefully, about what the objects were and where they came from." Claire looked at the binder in her hands. She looked at the paintings on the wall. She looked at her father. "Dad," she said, and her voice had changed, the attorney tone gone, something roar beneath it. "How long have you known about this?" Robert was quiet for a moment. "My father showed me this room in 1987, he said. I was 30 years old. He'd just been diagnosed with the cancer that killed him the following year. He showed me everything and told me what Harold had told him, that the pieces were valuable, that the documentation was important, and that he'd never found the right time or the right way to deal with it." 1987, Claire said. "Dad, that's nearly 40 years ago." "I know. Why didn't you?" She stopped, took a breath, started again. "Why didn't you deal with it?" Robert looked at his hands, those enormous, weathered hands. "Because I was afraid," he said. "Simple as that. I was afraid of what dealing with it would bring. Lawyers, questions, maybe complications about the origins, maybe, I don't know. My father had the same fear. And Harold, I think, had it most of all. He paused. When you're sitting on something like this, there's a way it can feel like it protects itself by staying hidden. Does that make sense? Claire looked at the paintings again. I need to call someone, she said. I know an art authentication specialist in Dallas. Already done, Robert said. He reached into the binder and withdrew a letter she hadn't seen yet. It was printed on the letterhead of a firm called Hartwell & Associates, Fine Art Authentication, based in Chicago. Claire read the letter. She read it twice. Then she sat down on the second stool in the room and stared at the wall for a moment. Dad, she said quietly. I know, he said. This letter says that preliminary examination suggests 2 of the paintings may be. Yes, that they may have significant attribution. Yes, this letter is dated, she checked. November of last year. Yes, you've known since November. Yes, and you let the payments lapse. You let it go to foreclosure. Robert looked at her steadily. There are complications, he said. Read the second page. She turned to the second page of the letter. The complications were significant. Outside, at just past 1 in the afternoon, a charcoal gray Audi pulled down the gravel drive. Douglas Fairwell had almost canceled. He had told himself on the drive down from Tulsa that this was a courtesy, nothing more. That it changed nothing professionally. That the math was the math, and 30 days was 30 days. He had told himself these things with the particular firmness of a man who needed to tell himself things firmly. He parked beside a Ford Explorer with a Dallas rental sticker on the bumper. He hadn't expected anyone else to be here. Robert Calloway came off the porch as Douglas got out of the car. Behind him came a woman, dark-haired, late 30s, in jeans and a barn coat. Her expression carrying the careful neutrality of someone who is professionally accustomed to keeping their reactions off their face, but was currently finding it challenging. Mr. Fairwell, Robert said. This is my daughter, Claire Reed. She's an attorney. Douglas absorbed this. He shook Claire's hand. Her grip was firm. Her eyes were the same pale blue as her father's. I wasn't aware you'd have counsel present, Douglas said. I'm not here in any official capacity, Claire said, which was precisely the kind of thing an attorney said when they were absolutely there in an official capacity. Fair enough, Douglas said. He looked at Robert. You wanted to show me the property. I do, Robert said. Walk with me. They started from the house and walked east, across the main yard, past the equipment barn, out into the back fields. Robert walked at the unhurried pace of a man who moved through this land every day of his life. Douglas matched it. Claire walked slightly behind them. The fields were brown and thin, the winter wheat struggling in the clay soil. Robert talked as they walked, about the land, about its history, about the drainage patterns and the water table, and the way the soil composition changed as you moved from the upland areas toward the creek bottom. He talked the way people talked about things they knew completely, without ego, just fact and context, and a particular fluency of long expertise. Douglas listened more carefully than he expected to. 3 years ago, this was all green to the fence line, Robert said, gesturing across the eastern field. 42 bushels an acre, winter wheat, before the drought. He paused, looking at the thin stands of grain. Drought's breaking this year. County Extension Office says soil moisture's been recovering since January. Whoever farms this land next season is going to have a very good year. Douglas said nothing. He was looking at the tree line along the eastern boundary, the Beaver Creek corridor. He was calculating. The creek bottom land, Robert said, as if reading his thoughts. That's the best soil on the property. Deep silt loam, good drainage, good moisture retention. My grandfather broke it by hand because the tractors of that era couldn't manage the roots. He looked at Douglas. I imagine someone with different plans for this land might see that bottom ground differently. Douglas kept his face neutral. The bank's interest is in the loan, Mr. Calloway. What happens to the property after you take it? Robert said, without heat. Just a completion of the sentence. After the process concludes, Douglas said, is a separate matter. Robert nodded. They walked on. They came to the eastern fence line and followed it north, with Beaver Creek visible through the trees to their right, a narrow channel of dark water moving over flat limestone. The banks overhung with willows and cottonwoods just beginning to bud. The air was colder here, damper, and smelled like water and mud and green things starting. Claire walked alongside Douglas now. She hadn't said much during the walk, but Douglas was aware of her, aware that she was watching him with an attorney's trained attention, cataloging. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure," Douglas said. "How long have you been with Meridian Capital?" 11 years. "Before that?" "Commercial real estate, development financing." He glanced at her. "Why?" "I'm curious about what you know about this area's development prospects," she said, academically. Douglas looked at her. She looked back at him. There was a beat of silence. "I know what's in the public record," he said carefully. "Of course," she said in a tone that communicated that she found this answer interesting. Robert had stopped ahead of them. He was standing at a particular spot along the fence line, looking north across the creek bottom. When Douglas and Claire caught up, he pointed. "You see that rise of ground north side of the creek, where the land comes back up and levels out?" Douglas looked. "Yes, 80 acres, that section. Best ground on the farm. My grandfather called it the table. Creek never floods it, never dries it out. Year-round grazing. You could build anything on that ground." He looked at Douglas when he said the word anything. Douglas felt something shift in the conversation, a subtle tectonic movement, like a change in pressure before weather. "Mr. Calloway, I want to show you the barn," Robert said, "before we talk about anything else. Come on." They entered the equipment barn from the main doors. Douglas looked around at the machinery, the old tractor, the combine, the shelves of parts, with the practiced eye of someone who had assessed the collateral value of farm equipment hundreds of times. The tractor was worth something. The combine, at its age, less. Robert walked to the back of the barn, to the wooden partition wall with the heavy commercial padlock. He unlocked it. He swung the door open. He turned on the work light. And Douglas Farewell, who had financed the purchase and sale of commercial properties worth hundreds of millions of dollars, who had sat across negotiating tables from developers and investors and lawyers for 11 years, who had trained himself to absorb information without visible reaction. Douglas Farewell stood in the doorway of a 20-by-20 room in an equipment barn in rural Oklahoma, and felt the bottom drop out of his professional certainty. The 3 paintings on the left wall, the tarped crates, the heavy work table covered in documentation. He stood in the doorway for a long moment. "Come in," Robert said. Douglas walked in slowly. He stood in front of the paintings. He was not an art expert, he knew that. But he had spent enough time in the offices of wealthy clients, enough time looking at walls where real things hung, to understand that what he was looking at was not decorative. It had weight, the kind of weight that came from age and craft and significance. "What am I looking at?" she said. Robert moved to the work table and handed him the binder. The Hartwell and Associates letter was on top. Douglas read it. He read the second page. He set the binder down. He looked at the paintings again. He looked at Robert. "These were authenticated," he said. "Preliminary authentication," Robert said, "not full documentation. That process takes time and is expensive. I started it last year with what savings I had left after the 3rd bad harvest." He paused. "I ran out of money to continue it before it was finished. That's part of why the payments lapsed." Douglas was quiet, processing. "If the full authentication confirms what the preliminary suggests," he said slowly. "Yes," Robert said. "Then this property, the farm, is carrying assets that would..." He stopped. He recalibrated. "What are you showing me this for?" Robert sat on his stool. He looked at Douglas with those pale blue eyes. "Because you're about to take my farm," Robert said, "and I think you ought to know what you're taking, all of it. And you think showing me this changes the loan situation?" I think showing you this might change a few things, Robert said carefully. But I'm not showing you it to leverage you. I'm showing you because you're a man who came here and walked this land with me for an hour and listened, and I think you deserve to see the whole picture. There was a pause. Also, Robert said, because my daughter has some thoughts about the legal situation that I think you should hear. Claire had been standing in the doorway. Now she stepped fully into the room and stood across the work table from Douglas. The authentication process, if completed, would establish the collection's value, she said. Conservative preliminary estimates in the letter put 2 paintings alone in the range of $800,000 to $1, $2 million pending full documentation. The complete collection, if the provenance documentation holds, could be substantially more. She paused. The arrears on the loan are $24,800. Douglas looked at her. I'm aware of the arithmetic, he said. Then you understand, Claire said, that my father has assets in this room that almost certainly exceed the entire outstanding loan balance. The reason he hasn't used those assets to cure the default is that they can't be liquidated in 30 days without a significant loss. Art, authentication, and sale through appropriate channels takes months, sometimes a year. That's not the bank's problem, Douglas said, but his voice had lost some of its professional smoothness. He heard it himself. No, Claire said. It's not. Legally, you're entirely correct. The bank has the right to proceed. She tilted her head slightly. But there's another issue. She reached past him and opened the binder to a section near the back. Pages of photocopied documents that Douglas hadn't looked at yet. The title situation, she said. Douglas leaned over the documents. They were old, handwritten, some of them, and what appeared to be legal documents from the 1920s. A deed recorded in Hughes County, and attached to it, a secondary document that appeared to be an amendment or rider. My great-grandfather Harold Calloway filed a deed restriction on this property in 1923, Claire said. It's buried deep in the Hughes County land records. It's been there for over 100 years, and nobody's looked at it carefully because there's never been a reason to. Douglas read the restriction. He read it again. This says, he said slowly, that any transfer of the property requires agreement from a secondary interest holder, Claire said. Specifically, the Calloway Family Land Trust, which my great-grandfather established in 1923 and which technically still exists as a legal entity under Oklahoma law because it was never formally dissolved. Douglas set the document down. He felt something that he recognized with an uncomfortable clarity as the floor of his plan developing a crack. Who are the trustees of this land trust? He said. Currently, by default succession? Claire almost smiled. My father and me. The work light hummed. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods along Beaver Creek. You're telling me, Douglas said, that any foreclosure action against this property would face a title challenge based on the deed restriction, Claire said, which my father and I, as co-trustees, have the standing to file, which would not prevent foreclosure indefinitely, but would introduce a legal complication that could tie up the title for 6 to 18 months. She paused, during which time, of course, the art authentication process could be completed. Douglas looked at Robert. Robert looked back at him. I told you I'd show you everything, Robert said. Douglas left the farm that afternoon without committing to anything. He drove north toward Tulsa with his jaw tight and his mind moving at a speed that made the highway feel slow. He had the windows down despite the cold, needing the air, needing the sensation of something moving. He had been outplayed. Not dramatically, not humiliatingly, but clearly and completely by a 68-year-old farmer and his attorney daughter. In a barn full of old paintings, and Douglas was smart enough, had always been smart enough. It was his primary professional asset to recognize when he had been outplayed and not waste energy pretending otherwise. The title restriction was real. He'd called the firm's title attorney, Margaret Osse, from the car, before he'd even cleared the county road, describing what he'd seen in the documents. She'd been quiet for a moment. Then she'd said, "I need to look at the actual filing. But if it's what you're describing, it's a complication we'd need to evaluate carefully." Which was attorney speak for, yes, this is a problem. The art was real, or appeared to be. The Hartwell letter was from a legitimate firm. He'd Googled them before reaching the highway. Chicago-based, 30 years in the business, major museum clients, and the land itself. Douglas merged onto I-44 and let his mind go to the place he'd been avoiding since the walk along Beaver Creek. He had spent 3 months planning the acquisition of the Callaway farm on the basis of the Cherokee Commerce Corridor development information that was not yet public, that he had obtained through a private conversation, that he had used to preposition Meridian Capital's interest in a property whose value would increase dramatically once the corridor became public knowledge. The word for what he was doing was insider positioning. The closer legal word was a different word, and Douglas knew it and had been managing not to look directly at it for 3 months, the way you managed not to look directly at a very bright light. Sitting in his Audi at 70 miles an hour with the cold April air coming through the windows, Douglas Fairwell looked directly at it. He had obtained non-public information about a state infrastructure project through a contact at the Commerce office. He had used that information to identify a target property. He had then, and this was the part he'd been most carefully not examining, accelerated the foreclosure timeline on a borrower who was in default but whose default was technically curable given slightly extended terms, because getting the property before the corridor became public was essential to the plan. He had done this before, not exactly this, but adjacent to this, variations on this. In 11 years of finance, Douglas had operated in the gray zone between aggressive and unethical with enough consistency that the zone had started to feel like solid ground. He had told himself that the market rewarded sharpness, that everyone did this, roughly, that the farmers and small business owners whose properties he'd moved through foreclosure had simply made bad decisions, and that consequence was consequence. He had told himself these things. And now he was thinking about a man who walked his own land with the unhurried knowledge of 3 generations, and talked about soil composition and drainage patterns and fence posts that were still in the ground from a century ago, and who had said, "I think a man ought to see what he's taking before he takes it." Douglas pulled off the highway at a rest stop north of Henrietta. He sat in the parking lot with the engine running. He looked at the flat Oklahoma landscape around him. Bare trees, red dirt, a water tower in the middle distance with the name of a town he'd never heard of painted on it. He picked up his phone. He thought about calling his contact at the state commerce office, the one who'd told him about the corridor. He thought about what that call would sound like now from this rest stop, with the Callaway documents in his head. He didn't make the call. Instead, he sat for 11 minutes, which he knew because he watched the clock on his dashboard. And then he did something that he had not done in 11 years of finance, which was to make a decision based entirely on something other than the math. He called Margaret Osei back. "I need you to look at that title restriction today," he said, "and I need you to give me your honest assessment of our litigation risk if we proceed, in writing, by Monday." "Douglas, that's a significant, I know. I also need you to pull the loan modification file and tell me whether there's a legitimate basis for a 60-day extension under the existing terms." A pause. "A 60-day extension. For Callaway?" "For Callaway." Longer pause. "Can I ask what's changed?" "I'll explain Monday," Douglas said. "Can you do it?" "Yes," Margaret said carefully, "I can do it." He ended the call. He sat for another moment. Then he opened the portfolio on the passenger seat and looked at the Hartwell letter that Robert had let him photograph with his phone. Preliminary examination suggests the 2 primary oils are consistent with work produced in the Chicago Impressionist circle of the late 19th and early 20th century. The larger landscape in particular presents technical and stylistic characteristics that, pending full authentication, we believe, warrant further investigation into potential attribution to. Douglas read the name. He read it again. He had not known enough about art when he'd read the letter in the barn to fully register what that name meant. He knew enough about commerce to understand what it might mean. He picked up his phone again and searched for 15 minutes, reading quickly. When he put the phone down, he looked at the water tower in the middle distance for a long time. The preliminary estimate in the Hartwell letter of $800,000 to $1.2 million for the two primary paintings was, he now understood, almost certainly conservative, significantly conservative, if the attribution held, and if the full collection's documentation was as intact as the preliminary evaluation suggested. Douglas started the car. He drove back to Tulsa not with the tight jaw and calculating speed of a man running numbers, but with the quieter, more unsettled energy of a man who had seen something he could not unsee and was in the early process of deciding what to do about it. He arrived at the Meridian Capital offices at 4:30 on a Saturday afternoon. The building was mostly empty. He badged in, went up to his floor, sat at his desk. He pulled the Callaway file. He read it from the beginning, not the way he usually read files, which was strategically looking for relevant points, but all the way through. The original loan from 2019, the first modification in 2021, the second modification in 2022 after the second drought year, the correspondence file which contained letters Robert had sent, handwritten letters on paper, which was unusual, explaining the situation, asking for consideration, describing the farm's position and his plans for recovery. Douglas had read none of these letters before. His assistant had summarized them as standard hardship correspondence, no new material information, which was accurate in a technical sense, but which had removed the thing that was now impossible to ignore, the voice in the letters. Precise, unsentimental, clear-eyed. A man describing a difficult situation without embellishment and without self-pity, presenting facts and asking, within the terms of the existing agreement, for a reasonable accommodation. He had written the last letter in January. I have assets that I am in the process of evaluating and documenting that may substantially change the financial picture of this property. I am requesting a 60-day extension to allow that process to advance. I am prepared to provide documentation of these assets as collateral for the extension. Douglas's assistant had summarized this as borrower claims unspecified assets in evaluation. Requesting extension, no documentation provided, which was also technically accurate. Douglas read the letter again. Then he opened a blank document on his computer and began to write a memorandum to the loan committee. He wrote for an hour. When he was finished, he read it back. It was the most honest professional document he had written in 11 years. It laid out the title complication, the art collection and its preliminary valuation, the case for a loan extension based on the borrower's documented asset situation, and, in careful but direct language, a recommendation that Meridian Capital pursue a structured workout arrangement rather than foreclosure. It did not mention the Cherokee Commerce Corridor. Not mentioning it was, Douglas understood, a choice he would have to live with and might have to revisit. But not mentioning it in the memorandum was different from acting on the information. And he was, for the first time in a long time, making a distinction between those two things that mattered. He saved the document. He looked at the Callaway file on his desk. He thought about what Margaret would tell him Monday about the litigation risk. He thought about the title restriction. He thought about the paintings on the barn wall. He thought about Robert Callaway standing on his porch in the morning cold, watching him drive away. Still, rooted. I'll show you everything. Douglas turned off his desk lamp and left the office. In Hughes County, the April night settled over the Callaway farm. In the equipment barn behind the locked partition door, 3 paintings hung on a wooden wall. The work light had been turned off hours ago. The paintings existed in the dark in the way that old things existed when no one was looking, patient, complete, indifferent to the concerns of the people who moved through the lit world outside. In the farmhouse, Robert Calloway sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee and his daughter across from him. The wood stove was going. The window above the kitchen sink showed the yard in darkness, the barn roof lit faintly by a half moon. "He took photographs of the letter," Claire said. "I know. That was deliberate. You wanted him to take them." "I wanted him to have something to think about on the drive back," Robert said. Claire looked at him. "Dad, what do you think is going to happen?" Robert was quiet for a moment. He wrapped his hands around his mug. "I think," he said slowly, "that a man who walks this land for an hour and listens, really listens, is a man who still has something in him that the job hasn't finished taking out." He paused. "I've been reading people my whole life, Claire. Same as I've been reading weather. And you read him that way. I read a man who came here to do one thing and found out the thing was more complicated than he'd made it." Claire looked at her coffee. "The legal position is real. The title restriction would absolutely complicate a foreclosure, but it wouldn't stop it forever. I know that. So this isn't just the paintings and the restriction?" "No," Robert said. "It isn't." "What is it then?" Robert looked at the dark window. Outside, the windmill turned slowly in the night air. "It's the whole picture," he said, same as I told him. Douglas presented his memorandum to the Meridian Capital Loan Committee on Tuesday morning. The room was a conference room on the 14th floor of the Meridian Tower in Tulsa, with floor-to-ceiling windows looking west over the city. And around the table sat 6 people: the regional credit director, 2 senior loan officers, the bank's chief risk officer, Margaret Assay from legal, and Dennis Hargrove, the regional president, who was 61 years old and had come up through community banking in Kansas before the industry consolidated around him. Douglas presented the case clearly and without editorializing. He laid out the title restriction, explained its legal implications as Margaret had assessed them: significant complication, estimated 9 to 18 months of title litigation, uncertain outcome, and then presented the art collection situation, including the Hartwell letter and the preliminary valuation figures. There was a silence at the table when he finished. Dennis Hargrove, who had not spoken during the presentation, took off his reading glasses and looked at Douglas. "You're recommending we extend," Dennis said. "I'm recommending a 60-day extension with the collection used as supplemental collateral, contingent on the borrower providing access to a full appraisal by a bank-approved appraiser within 30 days, Douglas said. "If the appraisal confirms the preliminary valuation, even at the conservative end, the borrower's asset position would support a restructured loan that Meridian could reasonably expect to be serviced. And if the appraisal doesn't support it, then we're 60 days further along in a foreclosure process that the title restriction was going to delay anyway, and we haven't lost any ground." Dennis looked at Margaret. "Legal? The title restriction is real," Margaret said. "My recommendation would be against initiating foreclosure proceedings until we have a clear assessment of our litigation exposure." Dennis looked around the table. The credit director, a thin man named Paul Bergman, who had approved the original Calloway loan in 2019, nodded once. "Approved," Dennis said. 60 days, appraisal condition as stated. "Douglas, you'll communicate the terms to the borrower?" "Yes," Douglas said. He called Robert Calloway that afternoon. The phone rang 4 times. Then the low, unhurried voice: "Mr. Calloway, Douglas Fairwell." A brief pause. "Mr. Fairwell, I've spoken with the bank's loan committee. We're in a position to offer a 60-day extension on the foreclosure timeline, contingent on you providing access to a bank-approved art appraiser within 30 days. The appraisal would allow the collection to be formally considered as supplemental collateral." There was a silence on the line. Not a surprised silence, more the silence of a man who had predicted something and was now receiving confirmation. "That's reasonable," Robert said. "You'd need to agree to the appraiser having full access to the collection and all supporting documentation. I'll have Claire look at the terms before I sign anything." "Of course." Another brief silence. "Mr. Farewell," Robert said. "Yes, thank you." Douglas paused. "It's the right business decision," he said. Because he needed to say something, and that was the truest version of what he could say in this context, in this conversation. "I expect it is," Robert said, "but I still appreciate it." The appraiser arrived 3 weeks later. Her name was Dr. Susan Whitmore, and she came from a firm in Kansas City that Meridian had used for commercial appraisals. She was 53, small and precise, with close-cut gray hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain. And she walked into the partitioned room of Robert Calloway's equipment barn and stopped for a full 30 seconds before she said anything. Then she said, "How long have these been here?" "About 100 years, Robert said. She looked at him. She looked at the paintings. She looked at the documentation on the work table. "May I?" she said, gesturing at the binder. "Please," Robert said. She worked for 4 hours. Claire sat in the barn the entire time, watching. Robert came and went, bringing coffee, doing the farm chores that needed doing. At one point, Dr. Whitmore unrolled 2 of the document tubes and spent 40 minutes with a magnifying glass, examining what appeared to be correspondence and invoices from the 1890s and early 1900s. At the end of the 4 hours, she sat back on the stool and took off her reading glasses. "I need to be honest with you about the process," she said to Claire and Robert, who were both in the room now. "A full authentication takes time. I can't give you a final number today." "I understand," Robert said. "What I can tell you," she said, "is that what I'm seeing here is consistent with the Hartwell assessment. And in my professional judgment, the preliminary figures in that assessment are conservative." She paused. "Significantly conservative." The room was quiet. "The provenance documentation is remarkably intact," she continued. "Your great-grandfather was meticulous. The chain of custody is documented through purchase records, correspondence, and inventory logs. That kind of documentation is, in this field, it's everything. It's what makes the difference between an interesting painting and a historically significant one." She looked at the large landscape on the wall, the red and gold one with the quality of light that seemed to come from inside the canvas. "I've spent 45 minutes with that painting," she said. "I have a strong opinion about what it is. I'm not going to state it formally today because I don't do that until I've completed the full process. But I will say," she stopped, looked at Robert, "your great-grandfather had exceptional taste and exceptional connections, Mr. Calloway." Robert nodded slowly. He looked at the painting. "Harold was a careful man," he said, "careful about everything he did." "He was," Dr. Whitmore said, "including this." She gestured at the documentation. "He built a record that a century later is still doing its job. The full appraisal took 11 weeks. During that time, the Calloway farm continued to operate. The spring wheat, benefiting from the improved soil moisture the county extension office had predicted, came in stronger than it had in 4 years. Robert hired back 1 part-time hand he'd let go the previous autumn. The cattle market firmed up slightly. Claire drove up from Dallas 3 more times, partly for the process, partly for reasons that were less legal and more difficult to name. Douglas Farewell drove down twice. The first time was at Robert's invitation to walk the back fields during the early green-up of the wheat, the first significant green Robert had seen on those fields in 3 years. They walked for an hour and a half. They talked mostly about the land, about soil, about water, about the table, the 80 acres of creek-bottom ground that looked west in the afternoon light, and caught it in a way that made the air above it seem to glow. Douglas did not mention the Commerce Corridor. He did, in the weeks following that visit, make a different phone call to his contact at the State Commerce Office, a man named Frank DeLacy, and that conversation was short and direct. And at the end of it, Douglas asked Frank to make sure that any future information that reached Douglas through unofficial channels about infrastructure projects would come through official disclosure processes instead. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said he understood. Douglas didn't know what that would cost him professionally. He suspected it would cost him something. He found that this was a weight he could carry more easily than the previous arrangement. The second visit was in late May, on a Saturday afternoon when the wheat was chest-high and the sky was the deep blue of Oklahoma in late spring. The kind of blue that made the red dirt and the green fields look like something a painter might invent if they were trying to capture the specific character of that particular place. Robert was on the porch when Douglas arrived. Claire's Ford Explorer was in the yard again. They sat on the porch. Robert brought coffee. Claire came out and sat in the rocking chair. They talked for 2 hours about nothing particularly consequential: the farm, the season, the local news, Claire's daughter Sophie, and her fixation on horses. Robert told a story about his grandfather breaking the table field, a story that had clearly been told many times and had the quality of something well-worn, the edges smooth with repetition. Douglas listened and thought about the memo he had written and the decision he had made and the things he had not yet fully worked out but was working on. At some point in the late afternoon, the conversation slowed in the way conversations slowed when people were comfortable with silence. Robert looked out at the wheat fields. The wind moved through them in long, slow waves, the kind of movement that looked like breathing. "Dr. Whitmore called me yesterday," he said. Douglas and Claire both looked at him. "She's ready to release the formal report," Robert said. "She wanted to give me a heads up before it goes to the bank." A pause. "And," Claire said. Robert wrapped his hands around his mug. He looked at the wheat for another moment. "The large landscape," he said. "The red and gold one, the one she spent 45 minutes with." He paused. "Full attribution confirmed. Documentation verified through 3 independent cross-references." Claire set her coffee down. "Dad," she said quietly, "the figure study, the woman by the window, partial attribution. Significant value regardless," she said, "given the provenance documentation." He paused again. "The other works, the drawings, the bronzes, the smaller oils. She's categorizing them as a historically significant collection from the Chicago Impressionist period. Museum-grade provenance." The 3 of them sat on the porch. The wind moved through the wheat. "What's the total figure?" Douglas asked. His voice was careful and professional, and also something else, something that had not been in his voice. The first morning he had driven down this gravel road. "She wouldn't give me a final liquidation estimate until I speak with a specialist dealer," Robert said. "But she said," he stopped, seemed to consider how to say the next thing. "She said the responsible thing would be to approach one of the major auction houses. That the primary painting alone, in the right sale context, in the right room." He shook his head slightly. "She used a number I don't quite have a reference point for." "How much?" Claire said. Robert looked at his daughter. "She said a conservative floor at auction for the landscape alone would be somewhere between $3 and $4 million. The porch was quiet. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the wheat field, one clear, descending phrase, then silence. Claire looked at Douglas. Douglas looked at his coffee. Robert looked at the fields. "The loan is $612,000, Claire said finally. "Yes," Robert said. "You could pay off the loan, pay the full arrears, pay Dr. Whitmore and the Hartwell firm, and whatever the auction house charges, and still have more than I'd know what to do with," Robert said. "Probably." He paused. "Harold was a careful man. I keep coming back to that." The formal appraisal report reached Meridian Capital's loan committee the following Thursday. Douglas presented it in the same conference room to the same 6 people. Dennis Hargrove again at the head of the table, Margaret Osei beside him, the flat white light of a Tulsa office building morning coming through the west-facing windows. The meeting was shorter this time. When Douglas finished, Dennis Hargrove looked at the report for a moment, then looked up. "This changes the collateral picture substantially," Dennis said. "It does," Douglas confirmed. "The loan is fully secured by the newly appraised assets, multiple times over." Dennis looked at Paul Bergman, the credit director. Bergman nodded. "The bank's position," Dennis said, "would be to offer Mr. Calloway a full loan restructure, extended terms, reduced rate in acknowledgement of the new collateral position, arrears rolled into the principal." "Margaret, anything from the legal side?" "The title restriction question becomes moot if the borrower isn't in default," Margaret said. "A restructured loan in good standing has no foreclosure trigger." She paused. "The complication resolves itself." Dennis nodded. He looked at Douglas. "Good work," he said, which was 2 words and carried. Douglas knew. The particular weight of words said by a man who didn't use many. Robert Calloway signed the restructured loan agreement on the second Friday in June. Claire drove up from Dallas. She sat beside her father at the kitchen table, the heavy oak table with 6 chairs, while a notary from the county seat drove out with the documents. Robert read every page. He asked 3 questions, all of them precise and relevant, and the notary answered each one. When Robert signed, he used a pen that Claire recognized, a heavy black fountain pen that had sat in a cup on the kitchen windowsill for as long as she could remember. She had asked about it once, years ago. Her father had told her it had been his grandfather Harold's. She hadn't thought about that for years. She thought about it now. After the notary left, they sat on the porch with coffee. The summer was fully arrived now. The wheat had been harvested 2 weeks earlier. The best yield in 4 years, the bins full. The soil doing what good soil did when weather returned to something like normal. The fields were gold stubble now, waiting for the next season. The cottonwoods along Beaver Creek were full and dark green. The afternoon light came long and amber across the table, the way it did in summer. That particular quality that made the air above the creek bottom land seem to hold the light rather than simply receive it. "Are you going to sell them?" Claire asked. "The paintings?" Robert was quiet for a moment. He watched a red-tailed hawk turn in a thermal above the south field. "The collection needs to be properly housed and documented," he said. "Harold built those records so the work would survive and be known. Keeping them in a barn, even in a locked room, isn't what he intended." He paused. "Dr. Whitmore introduced me to a curator at the Philbrook Museum in Tulsa. We've had 2 conversations. They have strong interest in the Chicago Impressionist holdings, the drawings, the smaller oils, several bronzes. There's a possibility of a long-term loan arrangement rather than an outright sale, which would mean they'd be properly cared for, properly displayed, and still, in some sense, ours. And the primary paintings. Those are a different conversation," Robert said. "A longer one." He looked at the hawk, still turning. "I'm in no hurry." Claire smiled at that. Her father, in no hurry. Some things were as constant as the red dirt. "What about Douglas Fairwell?" she asked. Robert considered this. "I invited him to the harvest," he said. "He didn't come, but he called. We talked for about 20 minutes. A pause. He's a complicated man who made some uncomplicated choices for a while, and is now, I think, in the process of making more complicated ones." Claire looked at him. "That's a generous read." "Maybe," Robert said. "But I've been thinking about something he said on that first walk. When I pointed out the table ground and said whoever farms it next season would have a good year." Robert looked at the creek bottom fields. He knew what I meant. He understood I knew something was planned for this land. He could have used that to push harder, moved faster, shut the conversation down before we got to the barn. He paused. He didn't. Claire was quiet. "That tells me something about a man," Robert said. "Not everything, but something." In August, Robert received a letter from the Philbrook Museum, formal, on heavy cream stationery, with the museum's seal at the top. It outlined a proposed 3-year loan arrangement for 17 pieces from the Calloway collection, including 6 of the drawings, 4 of the smaller oils, and both bronzes. The letter used language like significant historical contribution and enriching the regional art narrative and legacy documentation. Robert read the letter at the kitchen table in the morning with coffee. He looked up at the window above the sink. Through it, the yard, the equipment barn, the windmill turning in the August heat. He thought about Harold Calloway, who had come to Oklahoma in 1921 with broken ground and old paintings and a careful man's instinct for documentation, who had kept his records and locked his barn and told his son near the end of his life. And his son had told his son, and the weight of it had passed down like a debt, not a financial debt, but the more complicated kind, the debt of a thing unresolved. Robert picked up Harold's pen. He wrote back to the Philbrook Museum and accepted the arrangement. Douglas Fairwell attended the opening reception at the Philbrook that October. He had received an invitation from Claire, a simple card, handwritten, and he had almost not gone. He had told himself he was too busy. He had made that argument to himself for 2 weeks, and then, on the evening of the reception, had put on a suit and driven to Tulsa, the museum's Oklahoma Impressionist Gallery had been reorganized to incorporate the Calloway holdings. The 17 pieces were displayed together in a coherent section with wall text that told Harold Calloway's story, the years in Chicago, the move to Oklahoma, the careful documentation that had preserved the collection's integrity across a century. Douglas stood in front of the large landscape, the red and gold painting from the barn wall, for a long time. Under the museum lighting, it was different from how it had looked in the barn. The work light in the partitioned room had revealed it. The museum lighting made it fully present. The quality of light that seemed to come from inside the canvas was more pronounced here. The landscape it depicted was generic, no specific geography, just a suggestion of open land and sky and the particular warmth of a late afternoon. But there was something in it that felt, to Douglas, extraordinarily specific. Like a record of how a particular moment had felt to a particular person in a particular year that was now more than a century past. He stood there long enough that a young museum docent approached and asked if he had questions about the piece. "Not about the piece," Douglas said, "just looking." The docent smiled and moved on. Robert and Claire were across the room talking with Dr. Whitmore and the Philbrook curator, a young man named James Aldridge, who had the alert, reverent manner of someone in the presence of things he'd studied for years. Robert was in his good suit, a dark blue wool suit that fit him the way suits fit men who don't wear them often. He was listening more than talking. Douglas watched him for a moment. This man in his good suit in a museum, surrounded by the things his great-grandfather had carried out of Chicago 100 years ago, things that had waited in the dark of a barn for the right moment and the right telling. Claire noticed Douglas across the room and walked over. "You came," she said. "I came," he said. They stood side by side in front of the landscape. "The auction house in New York reached out," she said after a moment. "For the 2 primary paintings, the ones not in this arrangement, they want to schedule them for the spring sale." "Your father agreed? He's thinking about it." She paused. "He said he wants to wait until after winter. Get through another season first." She almost smiled. "He says he's in no hurry." Douglas looked at the painting. "There's something I should tell you," he said. Claire looked at him. "About the corridor project," he said. "The Cherokee Commerce Corridor. The reason I was particularly interested in your father's land." There was a pause. "I suspected something like that," Claire said carefully. "I know." He looked at the painting. "I want you to know that I've reported the situation internally. I've been working with the bank's compliance office for the past 2 months on a review of several files, not just your father's. There will likely be consequences that I don't fully know yet." Claire was quiet for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" Douglas thought about the rest stop north of Henrietta, the dashboard clock. 11 minutes. The water tower with the name of a town he'd never heard of. "Because your father showed me everything," he said. "I think I owe you the same." Another pause, longer. That took courage, Claire said. It took about 11 minutes, Douglas said. I timed it. She looked at him, uncertain whether that was a joke. He wasn't entirely sure himself. Across the room, Robert Calloway looked up and found Douglas's eyes. He held them for a moment with that level, pale blue gaze, the gaze of a man who read people the way he read weather. Then he nodded. Once, the way you nodded at someone you'd assessed carefully and found more solid than expected. Douglas nodded back. The winter came to Hughes County the way it always came. Early cold, the red dirt fields hardening, the cottonwoods along Beaver Creek going bare and angular against the gray sky. The wheat was planted. The cattle were moved to the winter pasture. The equipment was winterized. The barn was locked. In the partitioned room, the walls where the paintings had hung were bare now. The crates were emptied. The documentation binders were in a fireproof cabinet that Robert had purchased and installed in the farmhouse. The room smelled like old wood and the particular faint dustiness of cleared space. Robert stood in the doorway of the empty room one evening in late November, the work light on, looking at the bare walls. He thought about Harold standing in this room, or in whatever room it had been when Harold built it, before Robert's father had expanded the barn in 1962. He thought about what it had meant to Harold to lock this room and leave it locked. The fear, the paralysis, the weight of the thing unresolved. He thought about his own father who had shown him this room in 1987 and then died before he found the courage to deal with it. He thought about the 30 years he had carried it himself. He thought about a cold April morning and a charcoal gray Audi coming down the gravel drive and a man in a pressed suit who had come to take his farm. Sometimes the thing that forces a resolution is not the thing you would have chosen. Sometimes the crack appears in a place you didn't expect, through pressure you didn't invite. And when it breaks open is something that needed to be broken open for a long time. Robert looked at the bare walls for another minute. Then he turned off the work light and locked the room. He walked back across the dark yard toward the farmhouse. Above him, the November sky was dense with stars, the rural Oklahoma sky, unpolluted by city light, showing all of its depth and distance. The windmill turned slowly in the cold air. Through the kitchen window, light and warmth. The wooden rocking chair on the porch, the muddy boots by the door. This land is not ours. We are its. Robert Calloway went inside. In the spring, the wheat came up strong across all 640 acres. The table field along Beaver Creek yielded 51 bushels an acre, the best in the farm's recorded history. Robert noted it in the farm journal, in the same lined notebooks his father and grandfather had used, in the same careful hand. The primary painting sold at auction in New York the following April. The figure study, The Woman by the Window, brought $1, $4 million. The large landscape, the red and gold painting with the quality of light that seemed to come from inside the canvas, sold after 7 minutes of bidding to a private collector from San Francisco for $3.85 million. Harold Calloway's name appeared in the provenance notes of both sale catalogs. A careful man, his records still doing their work 100 years on.